We're going to continue on the topic of Thomas Jefferson and his suspicion of those who they labeled as blacks being naturally inferior humans. And what we're going to find out is that it takes a whole lot to fully convince Jefferson that that was not the case, right? Even after witnessing prime examples with his very own eyes, he still had a very difficult time coming to terms with what he saw. And so this is what we're going to talk about. And for us to do that, we're going to go into the book here. It's called White Over Black by Dr. Winthrop D. Jordan. And so let's go on here to page 448, where he writes this. One reason for the sudden outburst of interest in mental equality around 1790 was the sudden and far from fortuitous appearance of several Negroes to whose fresh example men might readily appeal. This is referring to the few anti-slavery writers at the time making the case for Negroes having equal intellectual capabilities of the whites. There were a few free Negroes who had done some exceptional things, and the abolitionists looked to seize upon those accomplishments to plead their case, right? And we should remember that these writers were making the case that Negroes lacked in the intellectual department, not because it was a natural or inherent trait, but only due to the circumstances of being in the slave environment, which perpetually sterilizes genius, as the Reverend Samuel Stanhope Smith put it. Now, with a few Negroes being free and excluded from that environment and actually accomplishing noteworthy achievements, the anti-slave writers were looking to present this as part of their case. And we'll see later on how Jefferson responds. Now let's keep reading. Benjamin Rush, first engaged in anti-slavery controversy in 1773, contributed again in 1788 by publishing a brief account of a Negro physician from New Orleans, James Durham. Let's stop right here. Who was Benjamin Rush? He was another founding father of America and a signer of the Declaration of Independence, just like Thomas Jefferson. He was a physician, politician, social reformer, and an anti-slavery proponent. So let's continue hearing about Dr. Rush and his account of James Durham, the Negro physician. Here we go. Dr. Rush was happy to call Dr. Durham a brother in science and commended him to the Pennsylvania Abolition Society as evidence of Negro achievement. He had to bring him out to show him off. Rush was also responsible for bringing to light the strange case of Thomas Fuller, a Maryland Negro who received more widespread attention than Durham because he was nearer to home and because he perfectly embodied the hopeful proposition that a slave might demonstrate great natural talent despite his slavery. Negro Tom, as his death notice in the Boston Columbian Sentinel described him in 1790, was a self-taught arithmetician born in Africa and brought to America at age 14. This famous African calculator humbly commenced his mathematical career by counting hairs on the tails of cows and horses he had been set to tend, and though illiterate, became able to perform complicated arithmetical calculations in his head. When called upon to calculate the number of seconds a man has lived when aged 70 years, 17 days, and 12 hours, he popped out the answer after only a few minutes' thought and, upon being charged with error, correctly suggested to his examiners that they had failed to account for leap years. What better possible evidence of native ability than this? Overnight, he became an anti-slavery hero, often referred to simply as the Negro mathematician. And this must have been a great marvel for a lot of people at the time, since they were not used to seeing people with brown skin and recent African heritage do those types of intellectual exercises. So he was kind of a poster child for the anti-slavery movement at that time. Let's keep going. The Columbian Sentinel was unrestrained, to put it mildly, in praise of
this untutored scholar. Had his opportunities of improvement been equal to those of thousands of his fellow men, neither the Royal Society of London, the Academy of Sciences at Paris, nor even a Newton himself need have been ashamed to acknowledge him a brother in science.
So we can see that we're impressed by Thomas Fuller, the Negro mathematician, to the point of acknowledging him as a brother in science, which was no empty words for that time. But pay attention right now, because we're about to be introduced to an even more impressive person from the group they tagged and labeled as Negroes. Here we go. The most widely known exemplar of the interracial brotherhood of science was Benjamin Banneker, also something of a mathematician. Born free in Maryland, he interested himself in mathematical puzzles, supposedly constructed a clock, and when loaned some books by a kindly neighboring Quaker manufacturer, Andrew Ellicott, became fascinated by astronomy. He was appointed member of the commission to survey the new national district. The Georgetown Weekly Ledger reported in March 1791 the arrival of Major Pierre Charles L'Enfant, a second member, and
Benjamin Banneker, an Ethiopian whose abilities as surveyor and astronomer already prove that Mr. Jefferson's concluding that that race of men were void of mental endowment was without foundation.
Here they go, going upside Jefferson's head again. Now, first off, did you notice that they called Mr. Banneker an Ethiopian? This was another one of those terms that they used at the time to tag people with recent African ancestry. So it wasn't meant to imply that he was an actual Ethiopian, because he was not. So let's understand that first. And so from here, the next thing is we have to remember that Jefferson's position was that he suspected Negroes to be naturally inferior in terms of intellect or being able to reason. So now the newspaper was using Benjamin Banneker as a counterclaim against those suspicions, right? Let's keep moving. Ironically, Banneker's nomination had come from the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson. Now, isn't that strange? Banneker's fame rested particularly, however, on his almanacs, published from 1791 through at least 1796, alternatively in Baltimore, Philadelphia, Petersburg, and Richmond. Now, what's an almanac? It's a publication of information that's typically based on events taking place within the calendar year. And so, for example, there are astronomical dates in an almanac, which tells the position of planets, the phases of the moon, eclipses, and so forth. Weather predictions are made in almanacs, which are used by farmers to help determine planting and harvesting seasons. I referenced an almanac for those purposes when I was working in the field of aquaponics, and it helped a lot with the planning, right? And so this is part of what an almanac is. Benjamin Banneker's almanac dealt with astronomy, which required astronomical calculations and obviously a great deal of intellectual ability, which, as we'll see later, was used to demonstrate the Negro's potential to Thomas Jefferson. Now let's keep reading. The first contained an introduction by James McHenry of Baltimore, once a medical student under Benjamin Rush, and by this time a prominent soldier and statesman, who provided biographical facts and his personal assurance that Banneker had performed the calculations in the almanac without assistance. McHenry had been careful to investigate these particulars. He said,
"As they form an interesting fact in the history of man, I consider this Negro," he went on, "as a fresh proof that the powers of the mind are disconnected with the color of the skin. Or, in other words, a striking contradiction to Mr. Hume's doctrine that the Negroes are naturally inferior to the whites and unsusceptible of attainments in arts and sciences."
We went over the madness of the Scottish philosopher David Hume a few videos ago, where he stated that the Negroes, and everyone else for that matter, were naturally inferior to the whites, and that whites were the only civilized people throughout history. And so James McHenry, who was an Irish-born immigrant to America, surgeon, Secretary of War, student of Benjamin Rush, and abolitionist, used the case of Benjamin Banneker to demonstrate that intelligence was disconnected from skin complexion. And we know that this must be the case because of what McHenry says next. Pay attention. In every civilized country, he added, there are many whites inferior to Banneker
in those intellectual acquirements and capacities that form the most characteristic feature in the human race.
And that's the truth, because we know the backwoods southern whites, who they called the hillbillies, they were not creating almanacs. They were displaying a different form of intelligence that was suitable for the world that they lived in, which was hog hunting, catching runaway Negroes, and things of that nature. But they were not making celestial calculations like Benjamin Banneker. And this is just in this country. If they were to have traveled to some of the other parts of Europe, they would have observed the many people who lived in the lower realms of society were also not doing anything on the intellectual level of Benjamin Banneker. So again, McHenry was demonstrating that color should be detached from intelligence. And remember that the anti-slavery argument hinged largely on the notion of Negroes being intellectually underdeveloped due to slave circumstances, right? Let's continue. The system which attempted to assign Negroes a different origin would fall as similar instances multiply, which must frequently happen, McHenry predicted, as slavery gradually disappeared. Which is to say that as more examples like Benjamin Banneker pop up, then the idea that those who they labeled as blacks originating from a different species or being naturally inferior would go away over time. The Baltimore printers of that first issue left no doubt as to the purposes for which the almanac was to be used. It
must be considered an extraordinary effort of genius,
by a Negro,
who by this specimen of ingenuity evinces to demonstration that mental powers and endowments are not the exclusive excellence of white people, but that the rays of science may alike illumine the minds of men of every clime, particularly those whom tyrant custom hath too long taught us to depreciate as a race inferior in intellectual capacity.
The almanac had been approved, they added significantly, by David Rittenhouse. Since Rittenhouse was far and away America's greatest luminary in the field of astronomy, this was benediction indeed. So Banneker's work on the almanac was approved by David Rittenhouse, a leading authority in the field of astronomy at that time. So this was a big deal. Rittenhouse had in fact written privately that Banneker's calculations represented
a very extraordinary performance, considering the color of the author. Every instance of genius among the Negroes is worthy of attention, because their oppressors seem to lay great stress on their supposed inferior mental abilities.
Since Banneker's almanac was a scientific feat, it might appropriately be forwarded to one of the nation's most prominent scientists. As an anti-slavery tract, it might logically go to an eminent man of anti-slavery views. And as a defense of the Negro's abilities, it might well be offered to a man who had traduced them. When Banneker sent a manuscript copy of his almanac to the Secretary of State on August 19th, 1791, he gave no hint that he knew of the Secretary's views on the Negro's nature, but confined his long letter to a brief suggestion that the almanac was evidence of Negro ability, and to lengthy remarks on the injustice of slavery. And who was the Secretary of State at this time? Do we remember? It was Thomas Jefferson, and this was Jefferson's response to Banneker. Jefferson replied to the old Negro briefly and courteously. Both letters were almost immediately published as a pamphlet.
Nobody,
Jefferson wrote,
wishes more than I do to see such proofs as you exhibit, that nature has given to our black brethren talents equal to those of the other colors of men, and that the appearance of a want of them is owing merely to the degraded condition of their existence, both in Africa and America.
One thing we'll notice with Jefferson is that he does a lot of tiptoeing, swaying back and forth, wishing and hoping when it comes to this topic. Banneker was a living proof, but Jefferson continued wishing for more, right? Here we go.
I can add with truth that nobody wishes more ardently to see a good system commenced for raising the condition both of their body and mind to what it ought to be, as fast as the imbecility of their present existence, and other circumstances which cannot be neglected, will admit.
Imbecility in this context means weakness or inferiority. So he's claiming that he wants to see a system in place that will raise the black brethren from their weakness in mind and body as fast as they could be raised. But we have to remember that Jefferson was a slave owner himself, and he profited immensely from that system which funded his lifestyle. So we have to examine Jefferson's words against his contradictory actions, right? But let's keep reading. It was a careful, courteous, and resoundingly ambiguous letter. The condition of the mind and body of the Negro was to be raised to what it ought to be. Jefferson was still unconvinced, still awaiting the dictates of science. Political partisans detected an inconsistency of tone between his letter and the notes. William Loughton Smith refused to let him get away with even a few words of courtesy about the Negro. William Smith was a Southerner from South Carolina and obviously a pro-slavery advocate who formed part of the elite plantation class. And so he didn't want to hear anything positive about a Negro, right? And so this is what he said about Jefferson's reply to Banneker.
What shall we think of a Secretary of State, thus fraternizing with Negroes, writing them complimentary epistles, styling them his black brethren, congratulating them on the evidences of their genius, and assuring them of his good wishes for their speedy emancipation?
He got spicy with Jefferson. Jefferson, an avid collector of both books and miscellaneous scraps of scientific information, promptly shipped off the manuscript almanac to the Marquis de Condorcet. He was happy, he wrote Condorcet, to proffer this evidence that a Negro had become
a very respectable mathematician. I have seen,
Jefferson continued,
very elegant solutions of geometrical problems by him. Add to this that he is a very worthy and respectable member of society. He is a free man. I shall be delighted to see these instances of moral eminence so multiplied as to prove that the want of talents observed in them is merely the effect of their degraded condition, and not proceeding from any difference in the structure of the parts on which intellect depends.
As these remarks so clearly indicate, Jefferson had been thrown into confusion by his unsettling confrontation with Banneker. Having attempted to transform Banneker's achievement into an instance of moral eminence, thereby dodging the problem of intellectual ability, he forced himself back to the issue at hand and suggested that moral eminence might offer proof that Negroes were not deficient in the structure of the parts on which intellect depends. In light of his firm conviction that the moral sense and the faculties of intellect constituted completely separate entities, this simply made no sense. He's right, it didn't make any sense. Banneker was displaying an intellectual feat which was clearly distinguishable from the realm of morals. But that's Jefferson for you. Jefferson's confusion at times became monumental. On the one hand, he had intellectually derived his belief in human equality from the existence of an orderly creation which had shaped every natural species each to its own mold. And on the other, he possessed a larger unquestioning faith, strengthened by his political experience, which predisposed him toward equality. The problem of the Negro's intellect stripped these approaches of their apparent congruity, for he could not rid himself of the suspicion that the Negro was naturally inferior. If this were in fact the case, then it was axiomatic that the Creator had so created the Negro, and no amount of education or freedom or any other tinkering could undo the facts of nature. Powerful and very interesting stuff when dealing with this topic of Thomas Jefferson and the intellect of the Negro, right? It's quite intriguing to see Mr. Jefferson torn between two worlds at once, right? And seeing how he responds and reacts. But what's even more interesting and more noteworthy were the blacks who rose to such levels in a society that openly opposed them, right? That's extremely impressive, right? To see people like Benjamin Banneker stand tall against the heavy energy of that society, which attempts to weigh them down at every chance it gets. We have to understand that some people just have a strongly developed will, and no matter what circumstance they find themselves in, they're unlike other people and they refuse to lay down, right? They refuse to quit. And so this is something to think about, right? And really consider. And so hopefully you found this video valuable. I want to thank you right now for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.